first time I'm going to speak.
Members will take their seats, and our guests and staff as well. The committee will come to order, and the chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. This morning we meet to mark up multiple common sense bills that have been thoughtfully and thoroughly considered by the Energy and Environment subcommittees. Throughout this Congress, these subcommittees have been working diligently and in a bipartisan manner to develop legislation that prioritizes the consumer, supports American business, and protects the environment. So these bills expand the nation's access to domestic energy resources, improve recycling and reuse of materials, and provide small businesses with the regulatory flexibility they need to meet environmental standards while still growing the economy and creating American jobs. Clearly, these are important bills, and I invite my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to work together constructively so we can move them out of the committee and one step closer to becoming law. Many of us on this committee, if not all of us, want to see America do a better job of harnessing its great hydropower potential so we can produce more clean and reliable domestic energy. Two of today's bills do exactly this. H.R. 2872 promotes hydropower development at existing non-powered dams, and H.R. 2880 opens the door wider for the construction of more pump storage hydropower projects, which is of particular interest to my constituents in the Pacific Northwest, where we have tremendous opportunities to build new pumped hydro storage facilities. Now, four of this morning's bills lift the heavy and unnecessary regulatory burden off the nation's brick makers, amateur racers, coal refuse to energy plant owners, and wood stove manufacturers by providing more time and compliance options in meeting EPA air regulations. It is important to note that none of the four sectors affected by this legislation are a significant source of emissions, and none of these bills repeal any regulation. They simply make minimal adjustments to reduce the risk of plant shutdowns and layoffs. In other words, these bills preserve jobs and save the consumer money while continuing the country on a path of reduced air emissions. The seventh and final bill we're marking up today, H.R. 1733, directs the Secretary of Energy to update the federal strategy for recycling used lubricating oil. The result of this bill will be maximized use of resources and a cleaner environment, an outcome that everyone should be able to support. All the bills being considered this morning have followed regular order, being the subject of legislative hearings and subcommittee markups where bipartisan amendments have been offered and accepted. This process has yielded carefully crafted and well thought out legislation. I urge my colleagues to support these bills. I now recognize my friend from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 3 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a number of bills before us today that came out of our Energy and Environment Subcommittee. On the energy side, we have 3 bills that I expect we will be able to pass by voice. Those are H.R. 1733, a bipartisan bill sponsored by Representative Brooks and Kennedy that directs the Secretary of Energy to review and update a report on the energy and environmental benefits of the refining of used lubricating oil. It's already been passed unanimously by the Energy Subcommittee. The other 2 bills, both seeking to expedite hydroelectric licenses for non-powered dams and pump storage projects, had issues when we started. We have now come a long way. Thanks to members and staff on both sides of the aisle, we have amendments in the nature of a substitute for both bills, H.R. 2872, introduced by Dr. Bouchon, and H.R. 2880, introduced by Mr. Griffith. These bipartisan substitutes are a testament to what we can do when both parties work together, and I want to thank Chairman Walden and Upton, as well as the sponsor of these bills, for working with Ranking Member Rush and me to develop a bipartisan compromise that we look forward to seeing enacted into law. Unfortunately, on the environment side of the ledger, we have quite a different story. Once again, committee Republicans are advancing bills to undermine public health protections and erode our progress on clean air. Exempting businesses from clean air rules leads to more air pollution, which damages people's health. Relaxing air standards for businesses does not reduce costs. It merely transfers them from one business to another and to individuals who will incur costs in the form of increased health care costs and lost productivity. Even the one bill where Republicans and Democrats have tried to come together, the Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports, or RPM Act, is ultimately unnecessary, in my opinion, since EPA has never taken enforcement actions against race car owners. I'll discuss these bills in greater detail as we consider them, but for now, I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair recognizes Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 1 minute, right? These are 1 minute. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I have my son in the front row, Daniel Shimkus, so if you could wave to everybody. It shows you I can do something right, so I appreciate that, or my wife can. The bills from the Environment Subcommittee that we are marking up today, H.R. 1917, the BRIC Act, H.R. 1119, the Sense Act, H.R. 350, the RPM Act, and H.R. 453, dealing with residential home heaters, have been the subject of staff-level discussion since the subcommittee markup. Each of these bills help small business and create and maintain jobs in their communities. As subcommittee, we adopted an amendment in nature of a substitute that addressed concerns raised in the provisions of H.R. 1119, the Sense Act. H.R. 350, 453, and 1917 enjoy bipartisan support. All of these bills provide the necessary leeway and flexibility to smaller entities so that they can meet the requirements of the Clean Air Act without addressing needless regulatory burdens. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition? Go to Ms. Castor, I think, would be next, right? Ms. Castor for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think at the outset it's important for folks to understand there are a number of bills here that undermine the Clean Air Act. I regret that my Republican colleagues seek to find huge loopholes in the Clean Air Act because the Clean Air Act used to be bipartisan. For example, H.R. 453 would delay for 3 years the implementation of standards for new wood-burning boilers, furnaces, and stoves to reduce emissions. These were the first updates to the standards for these devices in 27 years and would help protect the public health from harmful particle pollution and other dangerous pollutants. Many manufacturers have already certified devices to meet the 2020 standards. A number of these other bills go to the heart of the Clean Air Act, and I don't know why the Republicans continue to chip away and chip away and chip away at these fundamental protections for the public health across the country. This is unwise public policy, and I look forward to debating these to a greater extent.
Time's expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, I think, is next up on our side, Mr. Harper. And
thank you.
Welcome to your new chairmanship. We'll deal with that matter in a few minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing these common sense bills to the full committee for markup today. I want to encourage all members of the committee to support H.R. 453 as a compromise approach to easing a regulatory burden on manufacturers of wood heaters. H.R. 453 would simply give these manufacturers 3 additional years to comply with an Obama administration new source performance standards regulation. Frank Moore of Hardy Manufacturing, located in my district, testified before the Environmental Subcommittee in September that he and other manufacturers are working to meet the 2020 Step 2 standards, but that a lack of technology is making compliance nearly impossible. Extension of this effective date doesn't remove any regulations. All products will remain regulated by Step 1 of this rule. Extension simply provides more time for manufacturers to comply and come up with these stricter requirements and meet those requirements. I hope all members will support this, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Members on the minority side, Mr. Green. Recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the chairs and the ranking members for holding this markup today. We're considering 3 bills together that I briefly like to comment on. The hydro bills, H.R. 2872 and H.R. 2880, are bipartisan solution, respectively deal with non-powered dams and closed-loop pump storage. While we don't have a lot of hydropower in Texas, I know how important this resource is for many members on the committee, and I'm happy to see the committee working in a bipartisan way to advance the issue. I'm also pleased to see that we're advancing the bipartisan language on relubricating oil study to the DOE. We've also marked up 4 different bills that in some way involve the Clean Air Act. Unfortunately, I don't believe that the language in these bills as they stand is adequate to support it on the bipartisan basis. I'm no stranger to fighting against unfair regulation that is hastily crafted and poorly implemented, but I do not believe these bills or the regulations that they alter meet the standard. In one case, we have a further delay of regulations that were first proposed in 1988 by the EPA at the backing of many states who wanted to address it. As written, I cannot support these bills. Hopefully, before they get to the final, the floor of the House, we'll see some amendments. And I yield back.
Time's expired. On the Republican side, member seeking recognition, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Energy, Mr. Upton's recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just note quickly that we're marking up in full committee H.R. 1733, 2872, and 2880. All of these bills are non-controversial. They're bipartisan. 1733 is a bipartisan bill that simply requires the Secretary of Energy to update a report on the energy and tax environmental benefits of refining and used lubricating oil. Hydropower is the nation's #1 renewable producing electricity with negligible emissions. And H.R. 2872 was introduced to promote new hydropower development at existing non-power dams by providing FERC with the discretion to grant exemptions from license requirements for certain qualifying facilities. And H.R. 2880 was introduced to promote closed-loop pump storage hydropower developments by limiting FERC's authority to impose only licensing conditions that are necessary to protect public safety. These bills are a good faith effort to increase hydropower in the U.S. and urge all my colleagues to vote for them and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members on the Democratic side, Ms. Schakowsky is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. First, I want to congratulate Greg Harper as he becomes chair of the ONI, as well as Adam Kinzinger as he steps into the vice chair of the Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee, on which I'm the ranking Democrat. Today, we see 4 more attacks on clean air and clean water. The bills out of the Environment Subcommittee seek to undo, delay, or undermine rules at the Environmental Protection Agency, whether brick kilns, waste coal, wood stoves, or race vehicles. Republicans are working to chip away at critical protections for public health. At the same time, the EPA Administrator, Scott Pruitt, is undermining clean air and water protections from within the agency. It's clear that we are facing a multi-pronged attack on our environment, and Americans' health hangs in the balance. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members seeking recognition on the Republican side. We'll go now to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, many of these bills before us today will provide relief to small businesses across the country, particularly those that have been subjected to federal regulation that frankly doesn't make a whole lot of sense. For instance, the BRIC Act will provide the brick and tile industry with regulatory common sense and certainty, something these industries have not experienced in years. So I urge a yes vote on this important bill as well as the others that we're considering today. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members on the Democratic side seeking recognition. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned that a number of the bills before us today will ultimately increase pollution and harm the health of my constituents. In my district, residential fireplaces and wood stoves are the greatest sources of pollution in the winter. These products have long lifespans and do not turn over regularly, so the 3-year delay to stronger emission standards for wood-filled heaters included in H.R. 453 will mean much longer than 3 years of dirtier wood stoves. This is not the type of legislation that creates a cleaner, healthier world for our children and grandchildren. This bill, along with H.R. 1917 and H.R. 1119, moves us backward. At a time when the rest of the world is looking at ways to reduce emissions and clean up the air, we're talking about creating loopholes for polluters. I urge my colleagues to oppose these bills. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my district, we have a couple hydroelectric projects that will benefit from this legislation. Projects located in Morgantown, West Virginia, and Opelika that will generate about $36 million in private investment. But more importantly, they're going to create between 600 and 700 private sector jobs that will be important in the construction industry. And once operational, they will also be providing tax revenue for local and state governments. So thank you, Dr. Bouchon, for sponsoring this important piece of legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members of the Democratic side, Mr. Tonko, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we will consider 4 bills that were reported out of the Environment Subcommittee that would amend the Clean Air Act. Broadly speaking, each bill seeks to give a carve-out under the law. 3 of these bills were opposed by all Democratic members of the subcommittee. We know air pollution is incredibly damaging to our economy. It is responsible for respiratory illnesses, hospitalizations, and missed school and work days. Delaying these rules will result in our constituents breathing less healthy air. History has shown that we can grow the economy while improving air quality. There is no reason to delay the steady progress we have made. I want to reiterate my concerns with the bills before us today. For the record, I'm glad we could come together to reach agreement on the two hydropower bills. These bills will streamline the processes to develop certain hydro projects in a timely fashion while preserving environmental safeguards. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Members of the Republican side seeking recognition. Oh, yes. Oh, I got to come over to this side. Ms. Brooks, recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Energy Subcommittee and this committee for holding the hearing today and considering H.R. 1733. Also want to thank my colleague, a gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, for his support on this bill when we introduced it together earlier this year. H.R. 1733 requires a 2006 study mandated by the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to be updated to reflect current information about the benefits of re-refined lubricating oil and how its production and use could be increased. As we witness increased tensions among major oil-producing nations and the general public continues to become more concerned with human impact on the environment, re-refined lubricating oil has the ability to reduce the need for further crude oil extraction and can be effectively recycled indefinitely. Ensuring Congress has the current scientific data about the potential value of this material will allow legislatures to make the right decisions when investigating environmental and energy policy moving forward. I urge my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members on the Democratic side seeking recognition? Seeing none. Any members on the Republican side seeking recognition? Seeing none, we are ready to move forward. And the chair has a resolution of the desk, the clerk, and asks the clerk to report the resolution. You didn't think we were going to go that fast, did you?
A resolution offered by Mr. Walden.
Without objection, the reading of the resolution dispensed with. I'd like to welcome Mr. Duncan to the committee. As happy as I am to see him join the committee today, I think the happiest person on the committee must be Mr. Carter, who will no longer occupy the last seat on the dais. Mr. Duncan was elected in 2010, represents the 3rd District of South Carolina. In his previous life, he worked in the banking and financial services industries. So, of course, he'll be helping us claw back all that jurisdiction to the Energy and Commerce Committee. Prior to joining ENC, he served on the Homeland Security and Foreign Affairs Committees. The resolution we're considering today will appoint Mr. Duncan to the Energy, Environment, and Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee, so I look forward to working with him and ask everyone to extend a warm welcome to Mr. Duncan. I would also point out I occupied that seat at one point many years ago. Yes. Second, today's resolution appoints Mr. Harper as chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. Mr. Harper is currently chairman of the House Committee on Administration, which is singularly the second most important committee in the House. If you like our new digs and the screens and things, you have Mr. Harper to thank for all of this. He will continue to serve as chairman of the House Administration Committee. Now, I also want to put a footnote in there. House Ethics Committee is really important, too, since Mrs. Brooks chairs that and is here. But Greg is a lawyer by training, having practiced law for 27 years in Mississippi. With our broad jurisdiction, oversight's a critical function of our committee, and I know he is excited about his new role, and we are looking forward to the great work he will accomplish on ONI. So, Greg, welcome aboard. And finally, the resolution appoints Mr. Latta to the Health Subcommittee. Is there any discussion on the resolution? Seeing and hearing none. If there's no discussion, the vote occurs on the resolution. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the resolution is adopted. Congratulations, gentlemen. The chair now calls up H.R. 453 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 453, to deem the Step 2 compliance date for standards of performance for new residential wood heaters, new residential hydronic heaters, and forced air furnaces to May 15, 2023.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Okay. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
To speak in opposition to the bill.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I oppose H.R. 453, which would needlessly delay implementation of EPA's important standards for residential wood heaters finalized in February 2015, and those would help improve air quality, especially in communities where people burn wood for heat. The EPA issued the first new source performance standards for residential wood heaters in 1988, and this means the standards have not been updated in nearly 30 years. The new standards will provide tremendous health benefits by cutting harmful air pollution, including particle pollution, carbon monoxide, and air toxics. And particle pollution causes a range of adverse health effects, including asthma, heart attacks, and stroke. EPA estimates that the benefits of these standards will be up to $7.6 billion annually. Or put another way, for every dollar spent to manufacture cleaner wood heaters, we'll see up to $165 in health benefits. And blocking this rule, in my opinion, is fiscally irresponsible. The final rule has a gradual 5-year phase-in to allow manufacturers time to adopt, and the Phase 2 requirements don't kick in until 2020. If this bill were to become law and these standards were delayed, manufacturers will be able to continue producing outdated wood heaters that pose risk to our air quality and our health. EPA's rule is a reasonable one that is long overdue. It has important benefits, and it should be allowed to be implemented. H.R. 453 would reward slackers in the industry by allowing them to avoid compliance with standards that most manufacturers currently meet and standards that benefit consumers and protect public health. This bill would add years of delay to an already flexible, unusually long transition period. H.R. 453 is not fair, not to most of the industry who are meeting these standards, not to consumers who will continue to pay more for fuel, and certainly not to people in communities whose health will continue to suffer from the pollution that could have been prevented. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no, and I'll yield to the gentlewoman from Florida.
Well, I thank the ranking member for yielding time. Here's another example of how my Republican colleagues will chip away at the clean air that we breathe and the Clean Air Act. Members, did you know that many of the manufacturers for these products have already certified devices to meet the 2020 standards? And what you're going to do is you're going to penalize the good actors, the folks who have followed the law, who have followed the rules. Delay of the standard implementation for 3 years is completely unnecessary, and it will reward those companies that have failed or chose not to invest in development of cleaner appliances at the expense of the public health. These were the first updates to these standards for devices in 27 years because the science drove the decision-making. Clean air drove the decision-making. You should also know that these more protective standards only apply to new boilers, furnaces, and stoves. They do not apply to wood-burning devices that are currently in use. This is unnecessary, unwise, and the ranking member is correct. It's fiscally irresponsible as well. I yield back the balance of my time to the ranking member.
I thank the gentlewoman. I don't know if anybody else wants my time. If not, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Chair recognizes the new chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Mr. Harper, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to remind everyone that under this bill, no regulation is being removed or changed. This is simply an extension. You know, wood heater manufacturers are predominantly small businesses that are very important sources of employment in their communities. The research and development costs of meeting the 2020 standard are proving to be prohibitive for many manufacturers, and some have already laid off workers as a result. If we look at the economic impact, that's going to be substantial if this extension is not given. Remember that the first phase of EPA's new source performance standards for wood heaters took effect in 2015 and substantially reduced emissions with minimal problems. So there's already been a positive impact on clean air. However, the second phase of these standards is scheduled to take effect in 2020 and is proving to be very difficult for many manufacturers. So this would, an extension be for phase 2, would just extend the phase 2 compliance deadline by 3 years to May 15, 2023. And keep in mind that wood heaters are frequently used by low-income households and often in rural areas. The 2020 deadline is likely to raise prices on those least able to afford them. It may also restrict product choice, as only a fraction of current designs are likely to still be available. Therefore, if new wood heaters become more expensive, some consumers will opt to continue using older and higher emitting wood heaters. You know, keep in mind that wood heaters are relatively minor sources of emissions overall, and even less so now that the 2015 Phase 1 standard is in effect. And since many are used in rural areas that are in attainment with national ambient air quality standards, the impact of a 3-year delay on air quality would be negligible. This is a common sense bill that really will help these manufacturers and ultimately help consumers and ultimately help clean air quality. Remember again, extension of this effective date doesn't remove any of those regulations, and I urge that we adopt and pass H.R. 453. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, the question now occurs unfavorably reporting H.R. 453 as amended to the House. The clerk will call the roll. Those in support will vote aye. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Miss Eshue. Miss Eshue votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Miss DeGette. Miss DeGette votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Lobsack. Mr. Lobsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Ms. Stingel. Ms. Stingel votes no. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye.
Are there members not recorded? Ms. McMorris-Rogers.
Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Scalise is on his way, so we'll provide him time to get here. Yes, Mr. Peters. Clerk, yeah.
No.
Mr. Peters, no.
Mr. Peters votes no.
Well, you know you're not, and so we were kind of waiting to think you'd want to be. So that's a good vote.
Mr. Scalise votes aye.
Mr. Scalise votes aye. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 32 and the nays were 21.
The ayes 32, nays 21. The bill is favorably reported to the floor. The chair now calls up H.R. 350 and asks our clerk to report, please.
H.R. 350, to exclude vehicles used solely for competition from certain provisions of the Clean Air Act and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan? Yeah, but I'll do the amendments first. That's okay. Is that right? Yeah. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? Chair recognizes gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, although I do plan to withdraw it from consideration after debate has concluded.
All right. Field suspend. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 350, offered by Mrs. Dingle.
Chair recognizes gentlelady from Michigan to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment represents simple changes that are needed to fix this bill. We've all discussed this issue a lot, and Subcommittee Chairman Shimkus made a commitment to me that he would continue to work with me to try to fix this. I mean, what we are worried about, all of us, well, maybe not everybody in this room, but a lot of us love sports car racing. And we want people to be able to race cars, but at the same time, after you've seen auto manufacturers jigger with some of their equipment, we need to make sure that cars that are on the road are not illegal. I was hopeful that we could accept this language today in the spirit of working together toward a bipartisan compromise. Without the fixes outlined in my amendment, I cannot vote for this bill, and I really do want to vote for this bill. But I remain optimistic that conversations can continue on this issue, and I'm prepared to withdraw my amendment today if the chairman's willing to continue talking about this issue moving forward.
Do you want to yield to Mr. Shimkus on this matter?
I would be honored to.
Thank you. We have been meeting and working on language. Everybody wants automobile racing to continue. Everybody wants the Clean Air Act to continue to comply, and we want to make sure that vehicles that are on the road are on the road legally. The hurdle is there's just no way on our side that we're going to go to a national vehicle registration plan or program, either specifically stated or implied.
So would the gentleman yield?
I would.
We agree. So
I don't think our staff agree. So I don't think the language agrees. And so let's continue to work on it. We've had this discussion. We want to work it out. I'd like to come back as a member of Congress, but I can't if I go to a national vehicle registration program because
and I don't think anybody on
my
this
folks will lynch me on this side. So let's.
I too might be lynched. So we don't want to go to our funerals. But if we could really make this so, if we could work together before it goes to the floor. Regrettably, I'm going to have to oppose it today, but I want to be able to vote for this.
And I'll give you that commitment. Let's see what we can do. And
then
I yield back to the gentlelady from Michigan.
I would ask for unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment.
The gentlelady withdraws her amendment and yields back the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry that we've not been able to come to agreement on H.R. 350, much as I wanted to and everyone on this side of the aisle wanted to accomplish that. But I can't support a bill that undermines the EPA's ability to enforce the anti-tampering provision of the Clean Air Act. We don't need to move this bill today, in my opinion. We could continue to work with EPA and the Specialty Equipment Marketing Association to find a reasonable compromise. And I'm certainly willing to do that, and I'd prefer to do that. But if we move forward today with the language you proposed, I would have to oppose the bill and ask my colleagues to oppose the bill. The bill undermines EPA's current enforcement authority to go after companies that are marketing defeat devices to a much broader group of customers than those in the amateur racing community. And I don't think that's your intent, but that is what the bill will do. We knew at the start that this would be a difficult exemption to craft, but I thought that we shared two goals. First, to make these currently illegal conversions legitimate in the eyes of the law, and then to ensure that once converted to race cars, these vehicles would only be driven on a racetrack and never on the road. However, EPA informed us that the language in the bill will not achieve that second goal. It will not ensure that motor vehicles that have defeat devices installed in them will never be driven on public roads. And frankly, I don't understand it. The Trump administration's EPA says this does not work. And I'm now put in a position of defending the language that Administrator Pruitt's people say they need to enforce the Clean Air Act. It isn't a position that I expect to be taking very often, obviously. So all we're looking for is language that fulfills the dictate of trust but verifies, something I would think my Republican friends would appreciate, but this language doesn't meet the test of being able to verify. I can only conclude that the industry is really just interested in getting a loophole put in the law with no ability to enforce against violators, and that's a license to cheat that I can't support. Vehicle manufacturers have spent a great deal of time and money to produce vehicles that emit fewer pollutants, but with this bill, we're now letting a few companies earn profits by undoing those efforts and putting public health at risk in the process. So if you're not going to withdraw the bill, and it doesn't sound like it, I would like to continue to negotiate to find the right solution, but I would urge my colleagues to vote against the bill at this time. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time, and we do intend to continue working on this matter, as you heard from Mr. Shimkus and Ms. Dingell. And I know that the teams were working late into the night to see if they couldn't find common ground last night, it's my understanding. So we'll see if we can't continue to work on this going forward. Are there any Republicans seeking to speak on this matter? If not, we go to Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Recognizing the Protection of Motorsports Act seeks to exempt motor vehicles used solely for competition from penalties for altering a vehicle that results in increased emission of air pollutants, an exemption that already exists in the law. However, as was discussed at the legislative hearing, there are serious concerns with how broadly this bill is written. At the subcommittee level, we talked about working together to come up with further amendments to the bill in its present form. I support Ms. Dingell's amendment and would hope that we could come to terms that will enable us to support racing and allow the environment to be addressed. The bill in its present form, however, would make it more difficult, if not impossible, for EPA to enforce against manufacturers that produce emissions control defeat devices for vehicles. The Clean Air Act prohibits selling or installing parts that would defeat or bypass emissions controls. Emissions controls are needed to reduce particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and other pollutants from vehicle exhaust. Allowing vehicles with defeat devices to be driven on public roads is simply completely unacceptable. In my view, if people want to modify a car that they use solely for amateur racing, that's fine, but we cannot allow these devices to be marketed and sold to the general public, which will inevitably be the case with modified vehicles being driven on the road. I understand there is a concern that EPA may go after racing hobbyists, despite the fact they never have in the past. No one wants or frankly expects to see EPA enforcement against individual vehicle owners, and no one wants to curtail law-abiding racing hobbyists that are not taking their modified vehicles onto the roads. But this bill would block EPA from using its one course of action to prevent the proliferation of defeat devices going after manufacturers. We know that some companies have marketed these devices to the general public, and EPA has had success enforcing against manufacturers of defeat devices that have not been used exclusively for racing vehicles. In one settlement, the company had sold some 114,000 devices. I know there was talk between subcommittee and full committee about narrowing the language to address some of these concerns. I'm encouraged that these talks will continue, but I am disappointed that we haven't been able to find a compromise. I cannot stand for taking away an important and really the only tool available to EPA to stop illegal defeat devices and the pollution they enable. So I urge the members to oppose the bill as currently drafted. And with that, Mr. Chair, yield back.
Would the gentleman yield? Mr. Tomko?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, let me just address this enforcement discussion real quickly. Right now, under Section 113 of Clean Air Act, the EPA currently and will still have general enforcement authority. So, if in the case you use, if a manufacturer of a device sells 114,000, what usually happens is that raise alarm, and the EPA then swoops in to say, where are you selling these 114,000 to? And that's how the system now works. So we're not taking away any authority, general authority under the Clean Air Act. But we're, you know, in a state like Montana that doesn't have emissions tests, we're not going to then force a state of Montana to go into some emission testing regime that the Clean Air Act and the SIPs no longer currently require them to do. And that's part of the debate and problem. And we're going to continue to work on it, but I wanted to address the enforcement debate on this, and I yield back. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, but I think still, you know, the guidelines of the Clean Air Act should be maintained, and I got to believe there's a way to resolve this favorably for both sides of the discussion.
Gentleman yields back. I encourage all of you to continue this work because I think it sounds like might be able to get there. And the question now, anyone else seeking recognition? If not, we'll go to a roll call vote on this. Those in favor of favorably reporting H.R. 350 to the House will vote aye. Those nay, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Daggett. Ms. Daggett votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Stingle. Ms. Stingle votes no. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye.
Are there other members not, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye.
Mr. Engel.
Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no.
Are there other members not recorded who wish to be recorded? If not, the clerk will report the tally when ready.
Mr. Walden, on that vote, the ayes were 33 and the nays were 20.
Okay, the H.R. 350 is reported to the House as approved. The chair now calls up H.R. 1119 as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Environment on November 17, 2017, and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1119, to establish the basis by which the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency shall issue, implement, and enforce certain emission limitations and allocations for existing electric utility steam generating units that convert coal refuse into energy.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? Chair now recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak for a few minutes about the environmental benefits of the Sense Act. This Sense Act makes minor modifications to the mercury and air toxic standards, MATS, in order to keep the coal refuse to energy plants viable. This act will still require substantial reductions in air emissions from these facilities, but in a manner that is reasonable and achievable for them. In exchange for the added flexibility under MATS, these facilities will be able to continue operating and addressing the coal refuse problem. Coal refuse is particularly pervasive throughout West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, it's a major contributor to acid mine drainage, which pollutes thousands of miles of rivers and streams in coal mining regions. It's a source of major fires, which pollute the air and a fire hazard. Coal refuse piles are unsightly and a barrier to economic development. Look, there are only 19 coal refuse to energy facilities in the United States. Most of them are small, under 100 megawatts, and not all of them will avail themselves of the provisions of the Sense Act. Coal refuse to energy plants have thus far recycled over 200 million tons of coal refuse by combusting it to produce electricity. The resulting ash is environmentally safe and is used for the remediation. One of my district offices is located immediately adjacent to such a plant in Morgantown, West Virginia. And coal refuse to energy facilities are addressing the coal refuse problem at no additional cost to the taxpayers. And without them, The cost of remediation are estimated in Pennsylvania alone to be $2 billion. So expensive that little, if any, remediation activity would ever be undertaken. The net environmental benefits of the Sense Act are substantial, and I urge the support of the Act, H.R. 1119. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes, do you want to go first, or do you want Mr. Doyle? Okay, we'll recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Sense Act, introduced by fellow Pennsylvania Congressman Rothfuss, is a regulatory carve-out to help coal refuse plants comply with the Clean Air Act regulation. A majority of these plants are located in my home state of Pennsylvania. In fact, of the 19 facilities, there are 14 of them are in Pennsylvania. These plants have processed coal refuse or waste coal left over from mining operations for decades. These are mines that operated prior to Congress passing critical regulations and standards that mandate reclamation after mining was completed. The leftovers, waste coal, now blanket acres and acres across Pennsylvania, polluting local water sources and diminishing air quality. I've seen the impressive environmental benefit of these plants firsthand. They're part of a large effort to reclaim the hundreds of thousands of acres of orphan waste coal piles that blanket Pennsylvania. These mines in our state that powered the country from the Industrial Revolution on through the first two world wars simply left these enormous piles of waste coal for future generations to deal with. The coal refuse industry has enjoyed significant bipartisan support back in my home state, and I certainly share Congressman Rothfuss's support of the industry. But I cannot support this bill as currently written. A permanent rewriting of the environmental regulations that protect our planet and public health isn't good policy. I'll say this, the Sense Act is improved from last Congress's Sense Act, and last year's Sense Act was improved upon the bill that was introduced in the 113th Congress, but the underlying bill still goes too far. It isn't impossible for these plants to comply with the regulation under MATS. I've talked with plants on both sides of my state. A delay of a regulation is one thing. A permanent rewriting of a regulation is quite another. There are many other solutions to this problem. Instead of this permanent carve-out, why not increase grants available for emission control technologies, specifically for power plants that have accompanying environmental benefit? Why don't we pass the Reclaim Act that frees up AML funds? Now, I'm happy to say that I've begun conversation with members on both sides of the aisle, and we're going to try and craft legislation that helps expedite remediating waste coal piles in Pennsylvania and around the country. I hope we're able to include retraining programs for coal miners and other working-class Americans in these discussions going forward. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are willing to consider this future legislation as a potential answer to this pressing problem, but I must oppose the underlying bill at this time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance time. Other members on the Republican side seeking recognition? Seeing none. Members on the Democratic side, Mr. Pallone, recognized 5 minutes. Strike last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Doyle mentioned, there were some changes made in this bill, in this case by the Environment Subcommittee, that were a step in the right direction, since the committee print no longer includes the baffling cross-state provisions from the underlying bill. But this is not to say that all the issues with the Sense Act have been remedied. The MATS rule represents the first national standard to address power plants' emissions of mercury and other toxic air pollutants like hydrochloric acid. And the Sense Act is merely a carve-out for MATS that would give waste coal facilities license to pollute more than they should. And furthermore, the bill would lock in this weaker standard for the foreseeable future. A small number of waste coal units would be allowed to avoid controlling harmful pollution in perpetuity, regardless of any subsequent developments in coal in control technologies or new information on the health effects of their pollution. So why are we even discussing such an unwise change? Because the waste coal industry says they need and deserve a legislative earmark just for using the coal that wasn't good enough to burn in other power plants. But that claim doesn't pass the smell test. In the final MATS rule, EPA determined that emissions from waste coal units are no different than emissions from other coal-fired power plants and don't justify special treatment. When waste coal plant owners filed lawsuits challenging the requirements of the rule, claiming it was impossible for them to meet, the D.C. Circuit Court had little trouble rejecting those arguments unanimously. The judges pointed to evidence demonstrating that many of the waste coal units could already meet the rule's acid gas standard or alternative sulfur dioxide standard. The court also noted that some of these already compliant waste coal plants are among the best performing coal-fired power plants in the country. In fact, emissions from waste coal plants were used to set the standard that all power plants have to meet. And the Clean Air Act takes a reasonable approach to setting air pollution standards, setting emission limits based on what is already being achieved by the top performing facilities in the real world. So Congress, in setting up this program, did not want to merely maintain the status quo. They wanted all facilities within an industrial sector to make the necessary upgrades to reduce their pollution in line with the best performing units. And it turns out that waste coal units were these best performing units. So it's simply not true to say they're unable to comply with the MATS rule. And so I see no justification for allowing these facilities to emit more pollution than other facilities as the Sense Act would allow. And I yield to Ms. Castor.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Pallone. Colleagues, this is another bill in the package today that weakens the Clean Air Act. It weakens very important air pollution safeguards. And I wanted to share with you the comments of the American Lung Association. They sent over the following statement on the Sense Act. H.R. 1119 would weaken both the cross-state air pollution rule and the mercury air toxic standards by allowing waste coal plants to emit more sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide can cause breathing problems, asthma exacerbations, and reduced lung function. Even worse, sulfur dioxide also forms particle pollution that can shorten life, cause heart attacks, and lung cancer. This bill would put health at risk in communities both near waste coal plants and far downwind. It truly is an unnecessary and unfair special carve-out for these waste coal plants. And what we know is that these plants can meet the mercury and air toxic standards already. EPA has said so, the courts have said so, and what this bill will do in the end, if it passes, it will likely be result in additional air pollution that will impact the health and cost of communities across the country. It's also unfair because it's unfair to other industrial plants because it will allow these particular special coal refuse plants to emit higher levels of pollution, forcing other sources to cut even more of their emissions to make up the difference. For all of those reasons, I recommend that the committee defeat this bill, and I yield back my time to the ranking member.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, the Vice Chair of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Olson, for strike the last word for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I strike the last word, yield my time to the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, and we've been listening to this. We've been trying to work on this for some time, and you just heard the comments that they didn't like the bill. Some folks on the other side didn't like the back in the 113th Congress. They didn't like it in the 114th Congress. They didn't like it in the 115th Congress. Mr. Chairman, if we don't do something, this is just supporting the status quo. We've got leaching refuse piles getting into people's water wells. We've got a problem that we're trying to resolve. And instead of just supporting the status quo and arguing over this, I wonder whether over the years you will ever, some of you folks, will ever find a way to support something like this, to take care of it. I'm very concerned about it because there are so few plants, but this is cleaning up an environmental hazard. It's using coal that can't be used for any other purpose. And people say, we didn't like it 4 years ago, 2 years ago, they don't like it this year. Just when are we ever going to get around to finding language that we can accept? We've been trying to work across the aisle on this, and all we get is rebuffed. So I yield back, and I...
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Thank you. We want to get this solved. There's no state that has a bigger problem than mine. 14 of those plants are in my state. Some plants comply already. Many don't. Over 40 years that these facilities have existed, they've cleaned up about 4% of the waste coal in 40 years. There is a fund, and I believe, by the way, Mr. McKinley, you supported this fund, the abandoned mine lands. I mean, there's money available. I don't understand why we don't help these facilities comply rather than just try to exempt a regulation that allows them to still put pollution into the air. There's a solution to this, and I'm working right now with Mr. Rothfuss, by the way, on such a vehicle to do this. We do want to fix the problem. I just don't think that the answer to the problem is just to do away with one of, this got better because you took cross-state air out of it, but you still have mats, and you're eliminating mats. So I want to get it done. I want to work on it. It's a big problem in my state of Pennsylvania, and you and I have worked on many things together with regards to these industries. So I don't want you to think that I'm rebuffing you, because I'm not. I'd like to work with you and Mr. Rothfuss to get a solution that helps these facilities comply and continue to do some of the good work they're doing.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, perhaps the best solution would be, why don't you put some of the people that are such opposition to this and put their own legislation in, and let's address it from that perspective. But this seems like we've been doing this now in 113th, 114th, and 115th, and it gets rebuffed. Start it from the other side of the aisle, perhaps, and maybe we can find some resolution. And
would the gentleman
back
yield?
my time.
Would the gentleman yield? Mr. McKinley?
I yield my time.
All right.
Chairman from Illinois, Mr.
Thank you. Just to finish, I appreciate the time. I think the issue is newer coal refuse plants versus older coal refuse plants. Some can meet it, the older ones can't. And then for people who aren't from coal regions of this country, which we are, we understand the environmental challenge to have these hillsides of coal refuge and the leaching. So we don't think we're getting enough credit for the environmental benefits of cleaning these up. And secondly, in a lot of these areas, as you know, they are the poor areas of our community or in the rural areas. Third thing is, in cleaning up these sites, then we can go back into the redevelopment of these sites, i.e. in what we just did on the brownfield. So let's keep working. We're going to move this bill because we've got a member of Congress who's asked us to do this. We passed last year's bill on the floor, and we will pass this one on the floor. But if we can make it better along the way, we'd love to do it. But we're going to march forward because in our areas, they're asking us to do this. And I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Add back the ballots my time, all 2 seconds.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seeking recognition on either side? Seeing none, the question now arises on passage of H.R. 1119. Those in favor vote aye, those no, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Daggett. Ms. Daggett votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Stingle. Ms. Stingle votes no. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Burgess is not recorded. Mr. Burgess votes aye.
Other members not recorded seeking to be recorded? If not, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 31 and the nays were 23.
3123, the bill is approved favorably and reported to the floor. Chair now calls up H.R. 1917 and asks the clerk to report this measure.
H.R. 1917, to allow for judicial review of any final rule addressing national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants for brick and structural clay products or for clay ceramics manufacturing before requiring compliance with such rule.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? If not, Chair recognizes Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bill once more before we take the vote here in the overall committee. You know, the brick or the brick industry, the brick and tile industry, has really been through it over the last decade or so. Since 2005, between 2005 and 2012, they lost about 45% of the jobs in the industry. It has had they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars complying with rules, federal regulations that have been set aside by the courts with virtually no acknowledgement by the federal agencies that that effort had been put in. They are, in many cases, these companies are the mainstay of employment in the small communities that they reside in. In many cases, they are the largest employer. One gentleman, for example, Mr. Ryan Parker, president of Endicott Clay Products, in testimony before our committee, said this: as the largest employer by far in our county, we pay over $10 million in wages to our 325 employees per year. Let's not repeat the past errors which could cause many small businesses in our industry to close their doors unnecessarily. You know, this legislation doesn't ask for a lot. It simply asks that we apply common sense to these regulations. I don't need the full 5 minutes, I don't think, Mr. Chairman, because I think this legislation speaks for itself. With that, I yield back my time.
Would the gentleman yield to me?
Yes, I certainly do yield.
Well, I want to thank the gentleman for bringing the legislation. Just 3 short points. This is a result of the BRIC MAC, EPA's rule coming out in 2003 that was vacated by the court in 2007. So the court said illegal regulation, but the industry moved in that direction and some couldn't survive it. So what we're trying to do is stop that from happening again. Another reg, another lawsuit, another loss of jobs, and then a defeat in the court. So all this does is just delay the enforcement of the new rule until the court case is rendered. So, and the other great thing about the work that my colleague has done is very bipartisan. It has Congressman Bishop from Georgia on there. It has Congresswoman Sewell from Alabama on there, along with Republican members. So I think it's important, again, for jobs and manufacturing, and I appreciate my colleague for bringing it forward, and I yield back to him.
I thank the gentleman for adding his comments, and again, I think we've made the case why this is so important, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members seeking recognition. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am speaking in opposition to the bill. My Republican colleagues, in describing the need for this bill, say that it's necessary in order to delay the Environmental Protection Agency's brick and clay MAC rule until all judicial review has been completed. However, that's not true. It's completely false. The courts already have the ability to issue a stay of any compliance dates in a final rule as necessary to protect the public interest, and that's their job, and we should let them do it. We all know there have already been challenges filed regarding this final rule. It will be up to the D.C. Circuit when they review these challenges to decide whether to stay the rule. Well-established legal factors exist for granting a stay. These factors take into account whether there is a likelihood of success on the merits, the prospect of irreparable harm to the moving party and other parties, and most importantly, whether granting the stay is in the public interest. The courts have used these factors time and time to determine whether to grant a stay and for how long. There's no reason for Congress to override this process and the judgment of the court. And I think before we conclude on behalf of the D.C. Circuit that the compliance deadlines for the BRIC MAC final rule should be extended, we should let them take a look at the final rule. And ultimately, if a stay is necessary, the court can grant it, not Congress. And I don't know if anyone else wants my time. If not, I would urge my colleagues to vote against the bill, and I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffiths, recognized. Strike the last word for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get it set the record straight. Our job is to get the law the way that we believe is in the best interest of the people of the United States of America. We are not overriding the process. We're getting the process right. Going to court and trying to get a stay on something is expensive, it's time-consuming, and oftentimes people decide, well, we're just going to go ahead and comply because a lot of these regulations may be smaller brick manufacturers or smaller industries. And we saw in my district a number of facilities that were shut down on a prior regulation that was put out, and the Supreme Court ultimately decided that it was invalid the way that the agency had done it. That didn't bring the jobs back to my district. This bill is getting the process right for the American people, and that is our job. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Other members seeking recognition. Either side, seeing none. The chair now will put for a vote on the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1917 to the House. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, nay. And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mrs. Walters. Mrs. Walters votes aye. Mr. Costello. Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Daggett. Ms. Daggett votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Ms. Stingle. Ms. Stingle votes no. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes aye.
Other members not recorded.
Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye.
Are there other members not recorded who wish to be recorded? No, we're waiting. Mr. Scalise, I believe, is on his way in.
Mr. Scalise votes aye.
With that, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 31 and the nays were 23.
31-23, the bill is favorably approved. And we will now move to, Chair now calls up H.R. 1753 and asks the clerk to, H.R. 1733 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1733, to direct the Secretary of Energy to review and update a report on the energy and environmental benefits of the re-refining of used lubricating oil.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Re-refining of oil has been utilized in our country for decades, but the technology is constantly improving. The process removes contaminants from used oil, like our used motor oils, and it blends additives to restore that oil to its original effectiveness, and it can be done infinitely. Many federal agencies actually use this re-refined oil, DOD, U.S. Postal, and others, but yet the United States lags behind, well behind actually other developed nations in the amount of re-refining that we do. And so federal studies and recommendations are obsolete. There hasn't been a study done since 2006. And so what this bill does, it's asking for the study to be updated and that we have updated information to make it easier to educate consumers about the benefits of this product, how we can increase the collection, responsible collection of used oil, how we can promote sustainable reuse of used oil by federal agencies and others, And with that, I would actually urge passage of 1733 and also appreciate the bipartisan manner in which we have brought this bill through committee and to this committee. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the bill? Seeing none, without objection, let's see, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1733 to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the bill is favorably reported. The chair now will call up H.R. 2872 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2872, to amend the Federal Power Act to promote hydropower development at existing non-powered dams and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point, and the chair would recognize myself for an amendment in the nature of the substitute. And the clerk will report the title, and the amendment will be considered as read, and the staff will distribute the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2872.
Waiting for Mr. Bashan was going to offer this amendment. I would just say that this is an amendment that both sides have agreed to. I think it's in the nature of a substitute. I'm not aware of any problems with it in the trying to expedite our time. I would ask if any other member wishes to speak on this amendment that everyone's agreed to. Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of the substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on the bill as amended. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill as amended is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 2880 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2880, to amend the Federal Power Act to promote closed-loop pump storage hydropower and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for any amendment, for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have a bipartisan amendment at the desk.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized. The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2880, offered by Mr. Griffith.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm tempted to take the Bouchon approach and get the bill on the way, but I will say it's a good amendment that I have joined with Mr. Peters in offering it, and it helps us get closed-loop pump storage, hydropower development in the United States, and I will leave it at that. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from California is recognized.
I just want to, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank Mr. Griffith for his work on this. It's a pleasure to work with him on an energy issue. Sometimes we don't see eye to eye, but on hydropower, I think there's a lot of agreement, and we appreciate all the work of the committee as well. Thank you.
I know they need additional water in California based on the fires that we saw on TV today, too. So, other amendments, other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Can you share the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question occurs on H.R. 2880 as amended. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation considered by the committee today. So ordered, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Good job.